Hi there, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us here today for this Cisco webinar. We're so pleased to have Jamie joining us discussing application and cloud security. She'll be doing an overview. My name is Lynn Dome and I'm Women in Cybersecurity Executive Director. We often go by our acronym WiCyS, W-I-C-Y-S, and we pronounce it WiCyS like we sisters because it's exactly what we are. We are a cyber sisterhood. And we're a community comprised of women, men, allies, and advocates with 5,500 plus members all throughout the world. We have representation in over 70 countries, and we have 44 professional affiliates in Africa, Australia, Canada, France, India, Pakistan, the UK, and throughout the United States. In addition to that, we have over 160 student chapters. So our mission is to recruit, retain, and advance women in cybersecurity, and we do so by creating opportunities. If you go to our website, WiCyS.org, you'll see that we have WiCyS initiatives, WiCyS events, and WiCyS training programs. If you become a member, if you're already a member, in our member portal, there's many different special interest groups like neurodiversity in cybersecurity or Latinas in cybersecurity. We also have data privacy or cybersecurity law, all those special interest groups and so many more. Our newsletters and webinar series is ongoing, and we issue out scholarships, grants, and awards not only to our WiCyS conference, which our next conference is WiCyS 2023, March 16th through the 18th in Denver, Colorado, but we also issue out scholarship grants and awards to other conferences as well. Our Cyber Talent Emergency Fund is for students to apply and receive up to $599. Within 24 to 48 hours. And those are there for true financial emergencies, like you can't afford your rent or your car broke down. We don't want financial problems to inhibit your studies and get you to graduate in your cybersecurity careers. We have speaking media opportunities for our members to be what others can see, and that's the cybersecurity professionals that they are. And our Job Board Plus Plus is available for all our strategic partners, including Cisco, who brings us our webinar here today, to post their jobs and also recruit from our member portal and resume portal that's in the Job Board Plus Plus too. We have apprenticeship programs, internship programs, market research, leadership series, leadership summits, and veterans and military spouse assistant programs. A speakers bureau is available on our website under resources, and our mentor-mentee program has a curriculum designed to upskill and up-level women no matter where they're at in their career, preparing them for the next level of advancement. We have a racial equity committee that also keeps us in alignment with allyship, equity, and inclusion internally and externally as we continue to grow and expand our efforts. And we owe all this special thanks to our strategic partners. They're the foundation of all things WiCyS. We have our Tier 1 partners, AWS, Bloomberg, Carnegie Mellon Software Engineering Institute, Cisco, that brings us the webinar here today, Fortinet, Google, Intel, Lockheed Martin, Meta, Microsoft, Optum, Sandia National Labs, and SentinelOne. We have our Tier 2 here and Tier 3. So we appreciate all our strategic partners and each and every initiative that they make possible within the WiCyS organization. So today we have a great webinar planned with you. Jamie is incredible, and I'm so excited for you all to receive this information she's about to share as she's discussing application and cloud security. And we're so pleased that Cisco is able to provide us this webinar. So please ask questions all throughout the webinar. And Jamie is going to be answering them at the end of her presentation. So you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's that chat function. Put your questions in there and we'll queue them up and Jamie will be answering them live. And if you haven't done so already, engage with WiCyS. Subscribe to the newsletter, like us and follow us on LinkedIn. We're on Instagram. We have Facebook group, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all that, YouTube, and so much more. So we want you to be a part of the community and us to be able to provide you the resources that you need in order to expand and grow in your career. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it on over to Jamie for her to take it away from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn, for the intro. Yeah, WiCyS is a wonderful organization, and the conference is fun to join. So thank you for having me. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jamie Yu. I am an information security architect at Cisco InfoSec, working on securing enterprise applications and data hosted on-prem and in third-party clouds. My experience includes application security, cloud security, networking, vulnerability assessments, IDS, SAM, security policy and compliance. Prior to joining Cisco, I served as an information security officer in various technical roles in security and IT fields. I joined Cisco 6 years ago, initially focusing on cloud security vendor assessments. I interviewed hundreds of cloud providers, ranging from large companies like Salesforce, Microsoft, to small startup companies, to review the security posture of their cloud services. I also work with internal enterprise application teams to do architecture reviews and risk assessments. I've given regular trainings and talks on security topics to interview for internal and external audience. So thank you, WiCyS, for giving me this opportunity to talk to you today. I'm super excited to share with you some of my work and perspective in security fields. So here we go. The topic is application and cloud security overview. It's a big topic, and I'll cover a few key areas at high level in today's talk. Modern web applications are built on a tangle of technologies that have been developed over time and then haphazardly pieced together. This quote from the book, The Tangled Web, from 2012, still holds true today. The internet was not built to be secure. It was built to communicate. Security was often an afterthought. It's important for us to understand application and cloud security. The topics I'm covering today include software development lifecycle, threat modeling, secure design of a web application, secure code practice, vulnerable and outdated components, application security testing, encryption and key management in the cloud, cloud migration challenge, and cloud security recommendation. A lot of things to go through, so let's dive in. The world runs on software, and software is written in programming languages. If you have a chance to visit the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California, you would see a family tree of computer programming languages on an entire wall from 1954 to present day. Fortran was one of the first major programming languages, but there was not a common ancestor in programming language evolution. Humankind has created hundreds of programming languages. As more and more software got developed, people started to formalize a production framework to define the activities and deliverables in various stages or phases of software lifecycle known as Software Development Lifecycle, SDLC. Initially, security activities are only performed as separate tasks in the testing phase. Inevitably, this means too many vulnerabilities are discovered too late in the process, which leads to higher cost to fix and more vulnerable systems. In the early 2000s, faced with expanding usage of the internet and increased security and privacy concerns, companies started to incorporate security in every phase of the software development to produce more secure and reliable products. The concept of baking in security is now widely recognized and adopted in the software industry. By following a secure development lifecycle, we have better secure design, early detection of vulnerabilities in the system, lower cost of maintenance, and lower business risk overall. For example, Cisco Secure Development Lifecycle, CSDL, combines tools, libraries, processes, digitized validation, and awareness training to secure Cisco offerings and services. Every application team must follow a framework of secure development lifecycle and conduct security assessments and practices during all phases of software development. In the next few slides, I will talk about some of these security-related activities. Threat modeling is a process by which potential threats can be identified and enumerated and prioritized. It is an important step during the design phase of the development lifecycle. It is also one of my favorite topics in application security. By doing threat modeling, we think about security issues early on and invest our effort more wisely. It brings security and development together with shared understanding of risks, so developers can avoid writing insecure bugs into the code, which can be costly to remove later. When we do threat modeling, we ask these 4 questions. 1, what are we working on? 2, what can go wrong? 3, what are we going to do about it? And 4, did we do a good enough job? By answering these 4 questions, we essentially step through the entire threat modeling process. So we start with building a threat model. Remember, a model is a representation or a simplified version of a system. Once we have a model, we look at it from an attacker's view and ask ourselves, what can go wrong if I want to break this application or compromise the data? What are the ways to do it? Once we know the threats, what are we going to do about it? We can do nothing, accepting it as is. Most likely, we will try to mitigate and reduce the risk to an acceptable level. In the last step, we validate to find out how effective we are at mitigating the threats. This is a step where we typically run vulnerability scans and penetration testings. We'll reiterate this threat modeling process whenever there's change in the architecture design or use case that may affect the security or privacy of the application and the data. Let's take this online shopping application to demonstrate how to build a simple threat model. By interviewing the developers for the online shopping application, I just made it up, by the way, we have some basic understanding of what the application does, what are the elements in the application, and how these elements connect to each other. Now we are ready to build a threat model. First, user access the web server using a browser via HTTPS. We use a rectangle to represent a user as an external entity here. The circle represents the web server process. Next, the web server is in DMZ. We can use a dotted line to represent a trust boundary. The user is outside of the DMZ trust boundary here. Next, both the application and the database servers are on internal network. The web server connects to the app server. We now have 2 new elements, the app server and the database. The app server is a process represented by a circle. We use a cylinder shape to represent the database here. We have a new trust boundary between the DMZ and the internal network. Next, the application connects to the SQL database for user authentication. We connect the app server to the database server and add the description of the connection as SQL auth data. Next, the application checks the user's mailing address with an API call over HTTPS to a third-party address lookup service. We use a rectangle again to indicate it's an external entity behind a third-party trust boundary. Next, the application stores user purchase information in an online storage bucket. We have a new trust boundary between the internal and the cloud. As you see, we have a basic model for our online shopping application. It's oversimplified, I know, but just to give you an idea. From here, we can add more details to make it a closer representation to the real application we are building. Once we know what we are building, the next two steps are to identify threats and implement countermeasures. This is best done in groups of 6 to 8 people, including your solution designer, architect, DevOps team, and at least one security SME. Take the previous online shopping application, for example. I used the STRIDE method to identify threats here. STRIDE is the acronym of 6 types of threats: spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. For example, in spoofing, one of the threats is identity spoofing of a user. Maybe the attacker uses a phishing email to trick a user to enter email passwords on a fake website, and then the attacker can harvest the login credentials. Using the compromised credential, the attacker can then spoof the identity of the user to access the application. So one of the countermeasures may be requiring MFA, multi-factor authentication, and the user device posture check for authentication, which is quite common today. Another example in repudiation, the attacker may delete transaction logs to cover up unauthorized transaction. This violates the non-repudiation property of the system. In this application, the app server is affected. The countermeasure may be to secure logging and enhance monitoring of all transactions. For example, completing a purchase transaction only after the transaction record has been written to a centralized logging repository successfully, and not allowing overriding of the repository from the app server. So these are some of the examples just to illustrate. When we design a web application, we want to include security controls in the design from the start. All these controls can be identified and taken into consideration during the design phase of an application as part of the threat modeling exercise. These are examples of common controls related to a web application. Authentication and authorization controls: who can access the application, what type of data or functions the person can access or perform. Session management, reduce the attack surface of a connection to the web application. Data encryption makes sure that data is encrypted in transit and at rest. Input and output handling reduces several types of application vulnerabilities, such as injection, cross-site scripting. Error handling and logging enables monitoring and detection of anomaly in the application. Tiered architecture, user or tenant segregation. These are all common good controls for a web application. It's not just web applications that need secure design, but all applications. Take Internet of Things, IoT, for example. Devices that we install at home, smart watches we wear on our wrists, traffic control panels on city streets, vehicles that connect to each other and the internet. They are all running applications and can be vulnerable and exploited if not secured. To give you an example, just recently at the end of March, Bitdefender, a security research firm, released a white paper detailing 3 vulnerabilities in Wyze camera devices that they had discovered previously. Wyze cameras are popular security and surveillance internet-connected webcams. One of the 3 vulnerabilities is remote connection authentication bypass, CVE 2019-9564. It's a classic example of poorly designed authentication mechanism. Let's take a look. When connecting remotely, a client is required to log on to the camera device, right? This is usually a multi-step process. First, the client sends an IOCTL command with hex 2710 command. The device then generates a random value, encrypts it with a 128-bit secret key, and sends the encrypted value back to the client. The client, who also has the same 128-bit secret key, is able to decrypt and sends the value in an IOCTL command 2712 back to the camera. The camera receives the value and compares the value it receives with the value it stored earlier in the memory. If the values don't match, then no access. If the values match, then the client is authenticated and is allowed to control the device. Okay, so this is the entire process with the vulnerability. So if the client never sends the initial 2710 command, the device's memory remains null, which is all zeros, no values. When the client here, maybe an attacker, just sends the 2712 command with null, all zeros, as the authentication value, what's the device going to do? It's going to compare null with null in the memory and says, yeah, it matches, you are authenticated. So essentially, the attacker doesn't even have to know what the private key is and still gain full control to the device. Anyone can log in to anyone's Wyze camera with this authentication bypass. After authentication, one can do full control of the device, including motion control, disabling recording to the SD, turning camera on and off, among others. So when it comes to secure design, I would say not so wise for Wyze camera device. If you have Wyze camera, there's firmware updates available for version 2 and version 3 Wyze cams. If you have a version 1 Wyze cam, there's no updates, just toss it out and not using it. We do secure code training for developers to reduce vulnerabilities in application code and combat application level attacks. For example, an app can be tricked into jumping into portions of the code beyond the current user's permission, or an app can simply be shut down and become unavailable. The code in the application itself must be able to prevent these type of exploits. Traditional firewalls will not be able to thwart application level attacks. We also want to follow the principle of defense in depth. Applications developed without following secure coding practice can be vulnerable and be exploited, even with properly configured firewalls and access controls. This is especially important when it comes to applications in the cloud, when oftentimes the only barrier between the cloud application and the attacker is the user identity, right? Here's the list of the OWASP top 10. OWASP represents a broad consensus about the most critical security risks to web applications. OWASP is a nonprofit organization. It publishes the top 10 list every few years. Using the OWASP top 10, this one was published in 2021. is perhaps the most effective first step towards changing the development culture within your organization into one that can produce more secure code. When it comes to secure code practice to address OWASP top 10 risks, input validation can be used to mitigate some of the top 10 risks, as you see in this column, in the middle column. Parameterized queries and output encoding are other control examples that can mitigate injection flaws, which also include the common cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. You can visit OWASP.org to read more about these top 10 risks and countermeasures. Bobby tables is an example of injection flaws. Here in this comic strip, a specially crafted student name could wipe out the entire student record database, which is vulnerable to SQL injection attacks. Injection flaws occur when untrusted data is sent to an interpreter as part of a command or query. Almost any source of data can be an injection vector, such as environmental variables, parameters, external and internal web services, and all types of user input. Injection flaws are very prevalent, particularly in legacy code. Injection vulnerabilities are often found in SQL, LDAP, XPath, or NoSQL queries, OS commands, XML parsers, SMTP headers, expression languages, and ORM queries. Injection flaws are easy to discover when examining the code during a peer review. Scanners and fuzzers can help us find injection flaws. Of course, attackers also use the same tools, right, to find these flaws. Injection can result in data loss or corruption or disclosure to unauthorized parties, loss of accountability or denial of service, sometimes lead to complete host takeover. Comics aside, there are some real examples of unintended consequences of injection flaws. A few years ago, there was a story, it was a true story, of a null license plate landed a security researcher in a lot of trouble in California. Null is a text string in many programming languages that represents an empty value or undefined value. To many computers, null is the void. This guy named his license plate as null, N-U-L-L, for whatever reason, and ended up getting the traffic citations and hefty fines unrelated to him or his car. It turns out that a database somewhere associated null with his personal information for any traffic citation that didn't have a valid license plate number. Hence this advice here, do not choose null as a license plate. Many of us had our personal data stolen, not just once, but several times. This is one of the data breach that my personal data was stolen. Any guess what this data breach is? If you know, feel free to type in the chat. Okay. All right, so this is the Equifax data breach in 2017. The Equifax data breach started with the attackers using a widely known vulnerability that should have been patched, but due to failures in the Equifax internal processes wasn't. The demand on software development teams is greater than ever. With the cultural move towards DevOps, the implementation of CI/CD systems, and the desire to operate in an agile manner, developers are often being asked to push out more software faster than ever before. In turn, developers are increasingly relying on open source libraries or pre-built pieces of code available online, which allows them to add functionalities to their code and with not having to build it from scratch. The result is that software today is really made up of completely first-party code, but often assembled from other sources. On average, applications contain 7 open source vulnerabilities per application, according to Veracode. While this doesn't seem like a huge number, it only takes one vulnerability to compromise an application. Just like an iceberg, right? The bottom part is in the water and invisible, which makes it more dangerous than causing shipwrecks. In the case of the Equifax breach, one vulnerability in an open source Struct2 component had huge impacts, leaking social security numbers of 147 million Americans and leading to the resignation of the company's CEO. 2 years after the data breach, the company said it had already spent $1.4 billion on cleanup costs. In January of this year, the Equifax data breach settlement reached final approval from the court. So Equifax will pay $380 million into a fund for class benefits, attorney fees, and other expenses, up to an additional $125 million if needed, and potentially $2 billion. $2 billion more if all 147 million users sign up for credit monitoring for 7 years. So it's a not small cost. The recent discovery of Log4j vulnerability also demonstrated the wide and cascading impact of vulnerable common components. Using open source software is not a security threat. The real problem is not knowing that it contains vulnerability and that they're exploitable in your application. Software composition analysis, SCA, is a tool that can help track third-party and open source components in application code and can report on CVEs, version, license details, and vulnerabilities. Beyond the application code, if you use container or VM, don't forget the image scanner. Scan your image. And of course, the more traditional network host scanner can identify host vulnerabilities, especially with an authenticated scan. Many developers are familiar with security testing as part of the software release cycle. Here's a high-level comparison of static testing and dynamic testing. I get asked a lot. If you look at the software release workflow at the bottom, static testing is essentially a tool for developers to scan the code as they're writing it. It helps find the vulnerability much earlier on, which makes it also easier to or less expensive to fix. The dynamic testing happens much later in the software lifecycle and requires setting up a running application, typically in a staging environment, and you run a scan against it. Finding vulnerabilities later also means it becomes more expensive to fix. There are common vulnerabilities that can be identified by both types of testing, but some vulnerabilities are unique to each. The best practice we recommend is to run both tests. You'll get the best results. In recent years, there are new tools that are hybrids of SAST and DAST, called the Interactive Application Security Testing, IAST, and the Runtime Application Security Protection, RASP. IAST is designed to address the shortcomings of SAST and DAST by combining elements of both approaches. It places an agent within the application code and performs all its analysis in the app in real time and anywhere in the development process IDE, continuous integration environment, the QA, testing, even production. It provides immediate feedback because there's no scanner and you don't have to spend time on scanning like a DAST. It provides more accurate results with less false positives. It can identify the vulnerabilities and even the vulnerable lines of code, so it's easier for developers to find it and fix it. It can be easily integrated into CI/CD and DevOps workflow. So it's a good tool to use. RASP protects applications, vulnerable code, or libraries in runtime. It can respond to live attacks by terminating attackers' session. It typically integrates with a SIEM and sends alerts in real time. So these tools are more suitable for modern cloud-native applications. Cloud service adoption has increased in recent years. Our business workflows, which used to be in-house only, are now moving to the cloud. We're not only moving more data to the cloud, but also moving more sensitive data to the cloud. Encryption and key management is one of the controls we can use to protect data in the cloud. Encryption implementation in the cloud can be as easy as checking the checkbox, but the devil is in the details. We look at encryption risk factors in the cloud service by asking these 5 questions. Which technology layer is encryption implemented? Data encryption may be implemented at one or more technical layer. A certain model of the application architecture can give us a clear picture of where the risk gaps exist. What type of KMS is used? Is the crypto module compliant with the FIPS 142 standard? Who is managing the KMS, key management system, the vendor or us? Do we trust the provider to manage the key? How is the encryption key delivered? There are many ways to wrap the key for transport and deposit into a KMS. What is the impact if a data breach should happen? Always consider this worst case scenario. We should determine if the data encryption was implemented adequately to protect our data. Using these encryption risk factors, it helps us to design better encryption implementation in an application architecture. Although encryption is widely used today, it should not be just a compliance checkbox because you can be compliant but still not secure. And I'll give you an example later on. All right. Okay. Can we see the slides, Ling? Click on it again. Okay. Let's walk through this example on the screen. It's a sequence of S3 server-side encryption with AWS KMS. So step 1, data is sent from a client to S3. Step 2, S3 requests a data key from KMS. Step 3, KMS uses CMK, Customer Managed Key, to generate a data key. Step 4, the data key is sent back to S3 along with the encrypted form of the data key. Notice here that S3 doesn't know how to decrypt the encrypted data key, which is important. Step 5, there are 3 mini steps in step 5, starting from left to right. First, S3 encrypts the data with the data key. Next, stores the encrypted data with the encrypted data key to its storage bucket. And finally, removes the plain text data from memory. So the removal is also important. This is a very clean and well-architected encryption sequence. We can easily replace S3 with an application service we built, replace the storage bucket with the database, or replace the KMS with our own vault. You could also have a separate encryption service that takes care of the step 5 here. I have seen more complicated design where the key hierarchy may include multiple levels of keys, or a data key may be derived from a combination of a vendor key plus a customer key. Or the KMS service may involve additional authentication authorization. Studying these good examples of encryption architecture can help us design better in our own application architecture. Aside from server-side encryption, there is also client-side encryption where data can be encrypted locally before it's sent to AWS S3 server or any cloud data storage. Here's another example where my personal data got stolen. On July 29, 2019, Capital One Financial Group announced a data breach affecting 140,000 of their customers' social security number and 80,000 bank account numbers. In this case, the stolen number was stored in AWS S3 buckets. According to the Capital One statement, they said, we encrypt our data as a standard due to the particular circumstances of this incident. The authorized access also enabled the decrypting of data. A year after the data breach, Capital One was fined $80 million by a US bank regulator, the OCC. Who said in a statement that the Capital One fine was based on the bank's failure to establish effective risk assessment processes before it moved a major portion of its computer storage system, and the bank's failure to correct the deficiencies in a timely manner. Why didn't encryption save them? It's possible that they have used server-side encryption, which is the easiest way to comply with the data encryption requirement in the cloud. If they had implemented client-side encryption, they could still be attacked, but might not suffer such a severe impact, because what do you do with encrypted data, right? Server-side encryption in S3 can only protect against physical access to the disk. Remember this. It does not prevent AWS from viewing your data. Consider that as a bare minimum for storing data in the cloud, but also consider other options for more sensitive data you're storing in the cloud. If you can keep your keys safe, client-side encryption is the most secure way for storing data in the cloud. Is the cloud more secure or less secure? 10 years ago, the answer may be no. People were generally concerned about the cloud. As someone else's data center, they would say, it's out of my control, I don't trust it. Nowadays, people are generally more eager to adopt cloud services, right? I don't have to worry about running the platform, managing the infrastructure. I can just focus on developing the code and deliver to our customer. The cloud providers take care of it. And look at all the gadgets they made available at our fingertips. The cloud is scalable, it's fast, it's convenient to deploy my services in the cloud. The security team is trying to maintain the security standards as the business moves to the cloud. What do we have to do differently in the cloud versus on-prem? What tools are available in the cloud? We are figuring these out as we move to the cloud. Identity is one of the core controls to protect data in the cloud. This isn't necessarily the case for on-prem. Managing policy is critical in the cloud infrastructure, but not so on-prem. We have to change our mindset of relying on network controls and firewalls. We still have firewalls and ACLs in the cloud, but these are configurable settings that the app team can configure themselves, right? The attacker doesn't need to cross multiple layers of firewalls to reach our data in the cloud. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes the identity may be the only barrier between the hacker and our data. Shifting from the traditional network-centric thinking to identity-centric cloud security thinking is a major change. Instead of focusing on network security, we should pay more attention to application security, identity, policy management in the cloud. Encryption and key management is another core control. In the cloud, key management option is always a challenge. Do we trust the cloud provider to manage the key? There may be cases that we will want to handle the key management ourselves, not trusting the provider. It adds a bit more complexity, but provides more assurance. In the old days, we have traditional DLP. What do we have in the cloud? What do we know our data is still in the cloud and it hasn't gone anywhere? We need to manage and monitor at the data layer. Now, monitoring, detecting, and visibility is another core control in the cloud. The good news is that there are a lot of automation in the cloud providing this type of visibility. Although it may not be the same tools we typically use on-prem. Is the cloud secure? Is it secure by design? Who's responsible if I forget to turn on encryption or choose the wrong setting? In the cloud, there's this shared responsibility model where the provider is responsible for the underlying infrastructure and maybe the platform at the lower stack. And the tenant, the user, is responsible for the higher stack at the application and data layer. When the data gets breached in the cloud, whose data is it? It certainly is not the provider's data. We are 100% responsible for our own data security. So keep that in mind. Compute, network, and storage are not the only resources we use in the cloud. We're using hundreds and maybe thousands of cloud apps and platforms in today's business environment. So choose your cloud vendor wisely. Look for independently validated third-party audits, such as pentest reports, SOC 2 reports. Leverage various vendor security assessment platforms to gain a holistic understanding of the security posture of the vendor and the vendor ecosystem. Use a risk-based approach to conduct your vendor security assessments based on your use case, your data, and company policy requirements. Establish a set of preferred vendors to prevent sprawling. Instead of letting business teams onboard whatever SaaS apps with overlapping capabilities, invest wisely in vendors that align with your business strategy. We also need to configure cloud applications securely. Establish basic security hygiene when adopting cloud applications, such as SSO integration, secure admin access, password policy, logging and monitoring. Know where your data is going and who is accessing the data. Is there integration with another cloud applications? Take Office 365, for example. You could easily have many different apps, plugins, add-ons, integrating with Office 365 data through the Graph API. Is the app asking for more permission than needed? Is there security and privacy impact by exposing the data to a third party? Establish default secure configuration baseline in cloud applications. We want to refer to the vendor best practice recommendations, CIS benchmarks, and those best practice recommendations. Monitor configuration drift continuously. There are tools you can leverage to automate and track SaaS configuration baselines. So all of these will help us reduce risk while allowing us to take advantage of the modern cloud apps in today's environment. This is the last slide. Takeaways from today's talks are give a software development lifecycle with security process built in. Do threat modeling early on. Design your application securely. Train your developers on secure code practice. Track vulnerable and outdated components. Run application security testing as part of your CI/CD pipeline. Evaluate encryption and key management in the cloud. Embrace the cloud migration with a different mindset than the traditional on-prem security thinking. Choose your cloud vendor wisely and configure cloud apps securely. Last but not the least, security is never done. It's constantly evolving. I enjoy doing security. It's challenging. I never get bored. The application I'm deploying today may be clean of vulnerability, but may have a vulnerability tomorrow with the CVE assigned to it. Our dev teams are doing continuous integration, continuous deployment. We also need to do continuous security, right? As any good engineer will do, find the problem, analyze it, solve it, prevent it from happening again, and apply lessons learned to other areas. Even though we are never done, remember to take breaks along the journey and celebrate the milestones. This is especially important because there are not enough of us in this field. So keep learning and support each other. Thank you for your time. Thank you, WiCyS. To talk to you. I hope this talk gives you a glimpse into application and cloud security. If you have questions, email me, reach out to me on LinkedIn. Let me know if this is helpful or if there's anything I should improve. We can open up for Q&A now.
Great. Thank you, Jamie. I appreciate all that great content and information. Obviously, the audience did as well because we have questions coming in from the chat. Is the slides going to be available? We will upload and attach the slides to this recorded copy. Everyone that registered for today's event, they'll also be receiving an email with a recording of this copy of this webinar, and within there, the slide deck will be accessible as well. So I appreciate that. And then Jamie also provided her email in her LinkedIn profile, so you could reach out to Jamie directly if you have any particular questions with her. So we do have a few other questions that I'd like to tackle, and I know that we have, about 5 minutes here together, Jamie, so I appreciate your time and attention to this. But during the statistic application security testing, there can be multiple false positives in the report. This can increase a lot of work. How could we avoid this? That's a question from the audience.
That's a very good question. I hear that a lot. A lot of developers said there are so many false positives after I run the SAST, right? Unfortunately, that is a shortcoming of a SAST tool. What we can do is we want to run it as you write the code. So run it often and tackle it from early on. Some of the tool will allow you to mark the false positive, so the subsequent scans will not show up again. Right now, that's probably the only way that I can think of, other than using a better scanner with less false positive rate. But it does have this tend to have this tendency to have false positives. But you know what? If the tool is helpful, it allows us to review the code and run past it once and weed it out, the false positives, so you can focus on the real findings in the code.
Beautiful. Thank you, Jamie. Can you repeat your email address?
Okay. My email address is jamyu2@cisco.com. Maybe
Okay,
I can
great.
flash the last slide.
You know what? I
Okay.
just put it in announcements at the bottom of the
Oh,
screen.
okay. Yeah.
Yep.
So feel free to email me, jamyu2@cisco.com.
Great. And someone else commented, great information. They appreciate the content. So thank you for putting that in there. We appreciate you attending and being able to engage with Jamie during today's session. So one more question before we wrap it up is, what's top of mind for you today in cloud security? So that's a really great question, Jamie, and I'd love to hear your answer to that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Top of mind for me today is focusing on securing the configuration baseline of all these SaaS applications we're using today. So look at the second to the last slides. Those are some of the focus areas that I have today. And also, if you are working on migrating to the cloud, make sure your team is educated on the cloud so that you leverage the new tools, the capabilities in the cloud to do security. So it's definitely not a lift and shift in the cloud. Yeah, good question.
Yeah, very good. And you know what? We do have one more real fast. We're just going to sneak it in. Is should we do threat modeling on existing applications? If so, what's the best approach?
Yeah, certainly. You can do threat modeling at any time. For new applications, for existing applications, never too late. I often found teams, maintaining existing application, not even have a clue what the application does. So do that exercise, at least get the data flow diagram going to have a better understanding of the application. You can do it anytime. It's never too late to do threat modeling. And the best approach is obviously you want to gather the subject matter experts to look at it together, so we can build a closer representation of the model closer to the actual application.
Great. Thank you so much, Jamie. Well, I really appreciate your time. Great content, great information. Thank you, Cisco, for being a strong strategic partner, one of our founding partners. And then Jamie for sharing your afternoon, your knowledge, your expertise with not only me, but all the WiCyS participants that were able to join us today. So we really appreciate you. And everyone that's joined us, enjoy the rest of your afternoon and reach out if you have any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Lynn.
Bye-bye.
Bye.